as I mentioned last time, that can make nonfiction writing seem rather simple, like passive, um, just like stenography in a way, just like documenting in a passive way events as they happen. But I hope that you have seen from these writers that it's actually very complex and artistic. Um, Ta-Nehisi Coates is teaching us to feel a new kind of embodiment, to feel how racism creates kind of body, visceral experience that goes unrepresented and unacknowledged by um, society in um, normal social discourse. And uh, Rebecca Solnit's, description of the slippery slope of silencings is likewise looking at how people are silenced um, according to gender. And so is Zadie Smith. She's looking at how categories of race and gender determine what we hear, what we can hear as a voice versus as noise. Um, and I think that relates really powerfully to Alison Gopnik's account of the relationship between intelligence in childhood and in adulthood. Isn't that the most typical thing adults complain about children, is how noisy they are? And isn't that the very typical expression of racism or sexism, to complain about the noise of certain kinds of people? Um, uh, and I think that tells us, in these different ways, the different styles of these different writers, they're teaching us to hear in new ways, hear voices that we didn't hear, bodies, acknowledge embodied experience in ways that we couldn't formally. So, on the contrary, rather than just passively documenting reality, they're expanding, transforming our sense of reality. I've mentioned the importance of music in all these accounts, the centrality of music. Um, so one of the important things about it is that music disrupts our linear, objective perspective on the world. We have to become seduced. We have to we have to lose control in order to experience music, and let um, uh, it and let it kind of we have to let it channel through us in order to receive the message that music communicates. Um, we can't remain, objectively detached and pretend to understand uh, the message of a piece of music. We have to go through the experience of it, and that's what makes it like play. I was, suggesting earlier that, or Gopnik talks about the character Mrs. Havisham in Dickens, who ironically commands the protagonist Pip to play now, as if that were something that you could decide intentionally to do in a deliberate way. Um, but that's what makes it funny, is that it's not. And I think music works in the same way. You either react spontaneously, um, and or play spontaneously. It's a dynamic, interactive state um, that you fall into by losing your um, instrumental control over yourself, your sort of executive will and intentionality as a distinct individual, and it fall into this more interactive collective state of play. um, I have mentioned there are similar, you can think of, there are a couple, ways in which that remains prominent in an adult life. Play, maybe not so much, but the experience of music, of dance, the experience of sexuality, the experience of sleep. You can't entirely dictate these experiences. They all involve a kind of blurring of the boundaries of your self and loss of uh, autonomous executive control. Uh, and Alison Gopnik in this talk also mentions psychedelic uh, drugs, um, which have become increasingly um, studied and used for treatment of depression and PTSD, um, because she mentions here, they simulate the child's mind. A person's brain on psychedelic drugs looks in certain ways a lot like it sort of reverts to the operative structure of a child's brain. Um, and the result is that you can have the kind of plasticity of mind, openness to world changing kinds of experience, um, perspective changing kinds of experience, like Zadie Smith describes. And she notably talks a little bit about LSD in relation to Tintern Abbey. Um, um, so, going back to the question of culture, another point that Alison Gopnik really emphasizes is the issue of cultural learning, that children uh, learn through peer interaction, like I was talking about last time, um, and that this results in a cultural ratcheting, um, so that the experimental learning of children promotes the development of culture across generations. So if cultural development were dictated by adult learning alone, it would be much slower, right? Because there's so much less what Gopnik calls innovation going on. Innovation is a result of youthful and adolescent experimentation, um, and that um, interaction of adults and children, that interweaving that I was talking about last time, is what the engine of cultural development. Um, and so I think that's a good way to think about what we're getting in these texts, what this nonfiction writing is giving us, is experience precisely of surprises of what we don't expect, what doesn't seem to make sense, um, but that can transform our assumptions about reality, um, and not just about the objective world, but about the social world, um, to um, make that kind of transition that uh, all these writers are talking about, learning to hear new voices, moving from hearing noise to hearing a voice, moving from, isn't that a way of describing the experience of reading these books? What Sadie Smith says about Joni Mitchell. First, she did nothing for me, and then she undid me completely. Um, what we, yeah, I feel like these books each expose in different ways um, things you might not have thought about before, but now, like after reading the book, might be, one of the most important things you ever heard. That transition from the far margins of your sense of the world to something very central. Um, that's what childlike learning can do. That's what it can bring to culture, and that's how it enriches culture in a really crucial way. Um, that the normal model, not just of adult learning, but I'm afraid of our education system is in a lot of ways really hostile. Our education system is so instrumental, so directed toward the learning, teaching to the test. Um, Speaking of things that rock your world and really change your um, sense of sense of things, I just want to quickly plug these two movies I'm recommending this week: Run Lola Run and The Sweet Hereafter. Both are about the childhood in a way, especially girls, um, and I mean that in a um, deliberate sense. You can see the main character here; she almost looks like a Raggedy Ann, um, and the exploitation of girls, the failure to hear girls, um, and the terms that we've been looking at and exploring in these different texts, the way in which this marginalization um, is overcome, not in a direct way, but indirect, kind of oblique assertion of the power of dreams and art to communicate. Um, yeah, I'm tempted to go into about these movies. I'd love to talk to you individually if you're interested, or invite you to write about them. These movies play very intricately with time um, and address very disturbing topics. Um, not not graphically, but thematically. Um, address trauma and death, especially the Sweet Hereafter. Um, Run Lola Run is a little more fantastical, but it does address. It's about love and death. These kind of ultimate questions that as I've been talking about, kind of defy rational um, or utilitarian answers according to the normal utilitarian rationality of our day to day. But they also have a beautiful childish playfulness. The Pied Piper is the key motif in the Sweet Hereafter. It's sort of a retelling of the tale of the Pied Piper, and the alignment of children with music and dancing, and adults with money and um, exploitation. Another movie, it occurs to me just now that you might be interested in, if you want yet more movies to watch. Really great, uh, Heavenly Creatures by Peter Jackson, one of his earliest movies. It's based on a true story. Something all these texts, these films here, and the texts that I've asked you to read, all emphasize is the importance of accidents, the key role of accidents in life. that's what I think it means. That's what's entailed by um, uh, the acknowledging the limits of linear narrative, linear causality, um, that things that causes actually aren't necessarily rational or don't obey the pivotal causes in your life. In actual life, don't necessarily obey rational logic, causal, um, predictable causal patterns. I mean, I think that's such a basic and important thing. Is talking about these different modes of interactive experience, music, play, sexuality, sleeping. I mean, they're all. Um, it's interesting how they all involve a kind of transformative, blurring of the boundary of yourself with your environment. So that disrupts your normal sense of executive control, but it also disrupts, I think, your the normal logic of experience. Like what had seemed accidental, what seemed like an accident, can be really important. Um, and these movies they emphasize accidents. The Sweet Hereafter, the narrative turns on an accident. And Run Lola Run, it's so amazing. Like it's basically about a conversation that um, people have, a couple lovers have in bed, sort of a post-coital like moment of intimacy and reflection on the basic biggest questions in life, like what would you do if I died, or um, stuff like that. And the film itself repeats the same event 3 times, but it's changed just by different accidents that happen, just random circumstances. But it suggests that these conversations somehow change. The results of these conversations make just subtle changes in attitude that make accidents play out differently. And I think that's very important to think about. I know I mentioned to you my experience with depression, and uh, having read that idea that depressed people actually have a more accurate perception of probabilities in the world, and what's actually going on in the world. Um, so the lesson to take from that is not that you're right to be depressed, but that reality is depressing, and but that is not what life is about. Life is about aspirations and communicating, this irrational exuberance. I mean, if life were about being objective, that would be depressing. But that's we have this, minuscule little experience available to us to have, and it's not rational to find it meaningful, but in some sense, it's the only option we have is the delusion of the meaningfulness of our experiences. And the main thing I would want to just emphasize is that what that idea of confirmation bias, that what you expect, the attitude you bring to life, it determines so much of what you receive back in experience. Um, so. And that's because so much of life turns on these accidents, and so the attitude you bring makes certain accidents more, on your radar than others. And that's, I think, what really determines how much of life plays out. We think we know the important pivotal circumstances and causes of what's going on, but we really don't. That's a delusion, arrogant delusion, and so the attitude we bring toward what we can't understand is it does make all the difference. And so that again, it to show that's childlike wisdom, that receptivity, and bringing a kind of playful, open awareness of experience is what children are good at. And again, why our culture has such a prolonged childhood is because it's so beneficial to us, because it brings so much to cultural development. And the innovation and brought through childhood experience, childhood experiment, adolescent experiment, fails a lot, but its discoveries and innovations are crucial to the development of the culture at large. The culture would, stagnate and die if it just depended on the adults transmitting what they know, and if the peer bonding and cultural learning that children do and adolescents do in their experimentation, they're chasing glory for its own sake, and experimenting with what it means to be heroic. That's what brings meaning to the rest of culture. You can compare it to, so we were talking about Kierkegaard and the Night of Faith. Think about, romantic adventures, the romance of the night that goes off in search of adventure. That's it's an interactive experience. The knight goes out and doesn't know what adventure will entail. It's something the world will show him. So the romance of the night is, basically about this kind of childlike play with the world, and receptiveness to accidents, to, a bigger world of possibility than what we understand. On the topic of how life is about the attitude that you bring to it, that reality is dictated largely by the attitude, that history is. Here's a instructive little video about the power of metaphor, sort of what I was asking you to write about, the difference between metaphor and objective representation, and especially the metaphor of flowers, Zadie Smith's peonies. So this is about father and son having a little talk after the Paris terror attacks of several years ago.
Wanted to share it with you guys. Let's take a look.
Tu comprends ce qui s'est passé? Tu comprends pourquoi ces gens ils ont fait ça?
Oui, parce qu'ils sont très 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 méchants. Les méchants, c'est pas très gentil, les méchants. Et il faut faire vraiment attention parce qu'il faut changer de maison.
Mais non, t'inquiète pas. On n'a pas besoin de changer de maison. C'est la France, notre maison.
Mais il y a des méchants, papa.
Oui, mais il y a des méchants partout. Il y a des méchants partout.
Ils ont les pistolets, ils peuvent nous tirer dessus parce qu'ils sont très très méchants, papa.
C'est pas grave, ils ont des pistolets, nous on a des fleurs.
Bah les fleurs ça fait rien, c'est pour
Si, regarde, tu vois, tout le monde pose des fleurs.
Oui.
C'est pour combattre les pistolets.
c'est pour protéger.
Voilà.
Et les bougies aussi.
C'est pour ne pas oublier les gens qui sont partis. Hein.
C'est pour nous protéger les fleurs et les bougies.
Oui. Ça va mieux du coup?
Oui, ça va mieux.
Oh, that's amazing. But isn't it true? I mean, our world has its meaning because of a kind of irrational, devotion to certain fantasies of meaning. And so that's why I've told you I teach romanticism. I'm a romantic at heart, I think. But I think, it's not very complicated. Our world is chaotic and violent and harsh. And if you looked at from a rational point of view, largely out of our control, largely, dictated by unequal, unfair circumstances that don't have anything to do with us. So it's our kind of fantasies of meaning that organize our experience. And that, again, is why childlike experience is so vital. This peer learning, community, communal meaning, these are leaps of faith that become harder and harder the more you get locked into adult dogmas about what's true and worth while doing. This community forging, weaving of identity, the conversation, the cultural dance of interaction, noticing more complexity, more accidents than you could formerly, noticing an ever more complex world, and sharing different visions and conceptions of how it works, and our collective place in it, what it's for, what you are for on an individual level, and then what your relationships are for. That's what gives them meaning, is that attribution of a purpose, that leap of faith, that collective project. That's we're such communal creatures. We feed off each other's belief and faith, mutual faith in our collective project is what keeps it afloat, nothing else. So I've been talking about the sort of role of chaos, accident in our lives, and the crucial role of faith, of imagination, collective fantasies, and peer bonding, cultural learning. That is family creation. I like to. My favorite book to teach is Frankenstein, and one of the things that makes it so powerful to read, it's a story of engineering a person, and it's also about racism and especially sexism. It's really a book about patriarchy, but it's best known as a book about the power of science and technology to engineer personhood. And what I always think about in relationship to that book is, what if Mary Shelley, the author, could wake up today and see her readership, see us? What would she think of us? We would look like freaks of technology to her. Our life expectancy, just what modern medicine has changed our our normal sense of it, of life, of what normal human life is. Let alone all the other ways in which has COVID's revealed, like technology, the economy, race, have woven their way into our biology, and impacted our bodies. So that's, again, just to indicate the role of cultural aspiration, cultural projects, the pursuit of cultural meaning is so vital in changing our development in productive ways, rather than merely instrumental, utilitarian ways which drain life of meaning. So I've been emphasizing the importance of fantasy, aspiration, glory, the knight seeking glory, and that kind of thing, which sounds like the opposite of biological determination. So I want to show you now this amazing video by a neuroscientist, Robert Sapolsky, and where you think of neuroscience as being, about the way in which fantasy doesn't matter, the way in which our behavior is dictated by, brain, chemistry. But he has the opposite message, which is much more like what I was just saying. That history. This video ends with him inverting the commonplace saying, "Those that don't study history are bound to repeat it." He inverts it to say, no, history is about our capacity for total radical change, culture grows precisely because of its unpredictability, because of our freedom from causal determination. This is so fascinating. I'd encourage you to look. He's got a lot of videos, lectures online. I'd encourage you to check him out if you're interested. So the scenario here, again, we were just talking about violence and terrors, saying, so what happens? There's chaos breaks out. People are running through the street. You think you see somebody pull out a gun. You have a gun. Like, what makes you decide to pull the trigger or not? How does that decision get made? So he explores that.
Turns out that thing in this person's hand was a cell phone. So we asked this biological question: what was going on that caused this behavior? What caused this behavior? And this is a multitude of questions. We start, what was going on in your brain 1 second before you pulled that trigger? And this brings us into the realm of a brain region called the amygdala. The amygdala, which is central to violence, central to fear, initiates volleys of cascades that produce pulling of a trigger. What was the level of activity in your amygdala 1 second before? But to understand that, we have to step back a little bit. What was going on in the environment seconds to minutes before that impacted the amygdala? Now, obviously, the sights, the sounds of the rioting, that was pertinent. But in addition, you're more likely to mistake a cell phone for a handgun if that stranger was male and large and of a different race. Furthermore, if you're in pain, if you're hungry, if you're exhausted, your frontal cortex is not going to work as well. Part of the brain whose job it is to get to the amygdala in time saying, are you really sure that's a gun there? But we need to step further back. Now we have to look at hours to days before. And with this, we have entered the realm of hormones. For example, testosterone, where regardless of your sex, if you have elevated testosterone levels in your blood, you're more likely to think a face with a neutral expression is instead looking threatening. Elevated testosterone levels, elevated levels of stress hormones, and your amygdala is going to be more active and your frontal cortex will be more sluggish. Pushing back further, weeks to months before, where's the relevance there? This is the realm of neural plasticity, the fact that your brain can change in response to experience. And if your previous months have been filled with stress and trauma, your amygdala will have enlarged. The neurons will have become more excitable. Your frontal cortex would have atrophied, all relevant to what happens in that 1 second. But we push back even more, back years, back, for example, to your adolescence. Now, the central fact of the adolescent brain is all of it is going full blast except the frontal cortex, which is still half-baked. It doesn't fully mature until you're around 25. And thus, adolescence and early adulthood are the years where environment and experience sculpt your frontal cortex into the version you're going to have as an adult in that critical moment. But pushing back even further back to childhood and fetal life and all the different versions that could come in. Now, obviously, that's the time that your brain is being constructed, and that's important. But in addition, experience during those times produce what are called epigenetic changes. Permanent, in some cases, permanently activating certain genes, turning off others. And as an example of this, if as a fetus you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones from your mother, epigenetics is going to produce your amygdala in adulthood as a more excitable form, and you're going to have elevated stress hormone levels. But pushing even further back to when you were just a fetus, back to when all you were a collection of genes. Now, genes are really important to all of this, but critically, genes don't determine anything because genes work differently in different environments. Key example here, there's a variant of a gene called MAO alpha. And if you have that variant, you are far more likely to commit antisocial violence. If and only if you were abused as a child. Genes and environment interact, and what's happening in that 1 second before you pull that trigger reflects your lifetime of those gene-environment interactions. Now, remarkably enough, we've got to push even further back now, back centuries. What were your ancestors up to? And if, for example, they were nomadic pastoralists, people living in the deserts or grasslands with their herds of camels, cows, goats, odds are they would have invented what's called a culture of honor, filled with warrior classes, retributive violence, clan vendettas, and amazingly, centuries later, that would still be influencing the values with which you were raised. But we've got to push even further back millions of years. Because if we're talking about genes, implicitly, we're now talking about the evolution of genes. And what you see is, for example, patterns across different primate species. Some of them have evolved for extremely low levels of aggression. Others have evolved in the opposite direction. And floating there in between by every measure are humans. Once again, this confused, barely defined species that has all these potentials to go one way or the other. So what has this gotten us to? Basically, what we're seeing here is if you want to understand a behavior, whether it's an appalling one, a wondrous one, or confusedly in between, if you want to understand that, you've got to take into account what happened a second before to a million years before, everything in between. So what can we conclude at this point? Officially, it's complicated. Wow, that's really helpful. It's complicated, and you better be real careful, real cautious before you conclude you know what causes a behavior, especially if it's a behavior you're judging harshly. Now, to me, the single most important point about all of this is one having to do with change. Every bit of biology I have mentioned here can change in different circumstances. For example, ecosystems change. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was a lush grassland. Cultures change. In the 17th century, the most terrifying people in Europe were the Swedes, rampaging all over the place. This is what the Swedish military does now. They haven't had a war in 200 years. Most importantly, brains change. Neurons grow new processes, circuits disconnect, everything in the brain changes, and out of this come extraordinary examples of human change. First one. This is a man named John Newton, a British theologian who played a central role in the abolition of slavery from the British Empire in the early 1800s. And amazingly, this man spent decades as a younger man as the captain of a slave ship, and then as an investor in slavery, growing rich from this. And then something changed. Something changed in him, something that Newton himself celebrated in the thing that he's most famous for, a hymn that he wrote, Amazing Grace. This is a man named Zenji Abe on the morning of December 6th, 1941, about to lead a squadron of Japanese bombers to attack Pearl Harbor. And this is the same man 50 years later to the day hugging a man who survived the attack on the ground. And as an old man, Zenji Abe came to a collection of Pearl Harbor survivors at a ceremony there and in halting English apologized for what he had done as a young man. Now, it doesn't always require decades. Sometimes extraordinary change could happen in just hours. Consider the World War I Christmas truce of 1914. Powers that be had negotiated a brief truce so that soldiers could go out, collect bodies from no man's land in between the trench lines. And soon, British and German soldiers were doing that, and then helping each other carry bodies, and then helping each other dig graves in the frozen ground, and then praying together, and then having Christmas together and exchanging gifts. And by the next day, they were playing soccer together and exchanging addresses so they could meet after the war. That truce kept going until the officers had to arrive and said, we will shoot you unless you go back to trying to kill each other. And all it took here was hours for these men to develop a completely new category of us. All of us in the trenches here on both sides dying for no damn reason, and who was a them, those faceless powers behind the lines who were using them as pawns. And sometimes change can occur in seconds. Probably the most horrifying event in the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them. Mass raped women and children, mutilated bodies. It was appalling. It was appalling because it occurred, because the government denied it, because the US government eventually did nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and appalling because it almost certainly was not a singular event. This man, Hugh Thompson, this is the man who stopped the My Lai massacre. He was piloting a helicopter gunship, landed there, got out, and saw American soldiers shooting babies, shooting old women, figured out what was going on, and he then took his helicopter and did something that undid his lifetime of conditioning as to who was an us and who was a them. He landed his helicopter in between some surviving villagers and American soldiers, and he trained his machine guns on his fellow Americans and said, if you don't stop the killing, I will mow you down. Now, these people are no more special than any of us. Same neurons, same neurochemicals, same biology. What we're left with here is this inevitable cliche, those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. What we have here is the opposite of it. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, those who don't study the biology of what can transform us from our worst to our best behaviors, those who don't do this are destined not to be able to repeat these incandescent, magnificent moments. So thank you.